recording in case anyone present has questions or comments for us to chat about at the end here. Thanks to everyone watching. Thank you for everyone who commented. Thanks to everyone lurking. I hope you have enjoyed yourself and found this interesting. I neglected to give my usual spiel of La Missa è Finita. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. But all of you watching live get it. The ones on YouTube did not. Does language affect the perception of colors as well? That's a good question. I don't have an answer immediately. I think it probably doesn't, because gender is generally an attribute of nouns, and colors are generally adjectives. Of course, there are no. You can turn adjectives into nouns. I am going to look up something. I think these are neutral in German, for example. Let's look up some examples of from German and Italian. Might have to use Duden again. Some online dictionaries are more helpful for others, other questions. Unfortunately, you usually don't know in advance which is good for which, so you have to have a sort of mental map of them if you do this kind of thing often. And I, of course, actually do. I am failing to find a quick source for this. What I was thinking of are the nouns made from verbs. These are das in German and il in Italian, so neutral and masculine respectively. For the colors, I'll have to think of something. Something like greenness, grünheit. Grünheit would be feminine because height. So this words made with this formant are feminine. Rosita, for example, possibly for Italian. Il, yes, il verde for Italian. Whether or not this kind of thing affects their perception, I don't know. In the case of, I'll have to look up again for German. I have the idea that there would be das Blaue, or the blue of the sky, for example, but I can't actually find it in any source right now. Der blaue oder blaue Planet, die Erde. Das blaue Band. Well, that's just an attribute. Everything that I can find quickly would indicate that the nouns made from colors, or adjectives in general, are probably all have the same gender in most languages. So probably there wouldn't be much of an effect on the perception of colors. If there were some languages with different genders for different colors. I could imagine there being some sort of an effect, but this is something that I have not run into, so I don't have a factual answer for you, unfortunately. Something that I could... yes, something that I wanted to ask people was the possibility of art streams. As we are getting further and further in this series, the easy episodes are going to come to an end at some point when all of the fun grammar topics or general topics have been tackled, and all of the languages that I actually speak and I'm familiar with have been dealt with for snapshots. I will eventually get into topics that are more difficult. And in that case, it might take me more than a week of hobby level effort to make the slides. So in that case, what do you think as viewers? Would you be interested in having some art streams, for example? I'm not a pro illustrator, but I am very methodical, so watching me draw might help some of the people who are trying to learn to draw. Wait, we've been on easy mode this whole time. I'd say medium mode. The level of these presentations has been at the level that I find fun and interesting. So it's not the absolute simplest thing. Actually, since I don't have any experience teaching classes, I don't know where to start if I wanted to just, start from nothing. So I've started at the level that I enjoy thinking about and tried to make an effort to make them approachable for audiences that are not yet or not knowledgeable about the topic in advance. I guess for next week's episode is going to be snapshots for Irish. I guess that's going to be like middle-high level for me, middle-high difficulty. Irish is a Northwest Germanic language. I am familiar with many of its relatives, but I do not speak any Irish myself, and I have not really looked into the history of Irish before this, so I have to do some more work than, for example, for German. The level at which it would become, let's say, medium-high in general would be grammar history. That's something that I enjoy as well, but I don't know how much there is to talk about the topic. So it might be that I would have to have shorter presentations of different languages. For example, the history of going from Proto-Indo-European to modern Italian, for example. I don't know if I can build up an hour out of that it doesn't get too detailed. If it gets too detailed, it gets boring, even for me to talk about. We'll see in the future. I might even conceptualize an art stream as, for example, an anatomy lecture or anatomy presentation, as the way that I like to draw when I am making a huge effort is to actually draw the bones, then draw the muscles, then draw possibly some fat on it, then some skin, then the clothes interacting with the body. And because of all of this work, I very rarely actually get anything drawn, unfortunately. I'm sure you know someone who just starts drawing and gets nice results quickly. Unfortunately, I'm not that kind of a person. Well mentioned before that she found it easy for her to learn German from Irish. I don't know why that's the case, but it's certainly interesting to look at. So I remember this as well. I think that this will probably be a case of going through similar processes of simplification. Partially, possibly, some language, some contact effects as well. Irish has been under the influence of some Germanic languages for a while now, both North Germanic from the Vikings and English, of course. And Standard German is very Southern German, which has a definite Celtic substrate effect on it. So they might have... Actually, let's draw. So we have Irish and German. They have a common origin, and they have a sort of cross-pollination between them as well. Actually, a kind of comparative grammar history might be a good concept for a future stream. I'll have to look into it. At some point, I'm going to make my first grammar history presentation. We'll see how long it gets. If it comes out at around an hour, I'll be satisfied with it. And then maybe I'll allude to that in a future one, if the other one gets comfortably long as well. Or maybe if there are a lot of very similar developments in different languages, I'll maybe have one going through a particular language, and then maybe some comparison, more general comparison presentations. For example, we might go from Proto-Indo-European to Italian, and then compare the development to Italian with the development to German or to Irish, for example. The color question earlier had me thinking. I recall Japanese didn't have a distinction between green and blue. I wonder if there are other examples of that. There are. I got into this during my collaboration about Ludwig Wittgenstein. I think I have the chart. I copied a chart from an article for that presentation, and I think I have it somewhere saved. I think with quite a low quality, so it probably doesn't make sense to show you it, but if I can find it quicker than that article, then I could just copy it from it. But the thing is that there is indeed somewhat of a known development structure for differentiating between languages. To start off memory, you have generally the first step is just having light and dark and warm and cold colors. So you would use the same word for example, blue and black, but the same word for yellow, red, and white, for example. And in most cases, I think in all cases, but every time you say always, you run the possibility of being wrong, because there might be some absurd outlier. But let's say in most cases, or overwhelmingly, the... oh yes, here we have it. I am going to zoom into this on the other screen and copy it on the slide. So we have the first, we have white, red, yellow, and black, green, blue. Of course, colors are subjective. You can divide them in various ways. These are colors that generally become primary colors. So to my knowledge, in every single known case, you have this split as the first one. That you get white splitting from red and yellow. So you have white, dark, and a sort of warm color. Keep in mind that these are primary colors. So for example, in English, a primary color is, for example, green. I have green eyes. But you also have, let's call them secondary colors. I'm not sure what the usual name for this is, but these are basically similes. So it has the same color as something else in the world. So for example, emerald is not a primary color, but you can describe something as being emerald colored. For example, I have green eyes. I would also describe them as being a sort of an emerald colored color. So you get the point. At this point, it seems that, at least in most cases, you split into three parts. Either you have the red and yellow group breaking up and still retain the black, green, blue grouping, or you have the cold group breaking up, so you have white, red, yellow, and then green. Let me draw a better G. Green, blue, and black as its own thing. Or you have the somewhat of a bizarre merger where you have white and red, but then you get yellow from the warm group and combine it with green and blue, and then have black on its own. As far as I know, there are no examples of, for example, the white and red splitting off from yellow, black, green, and blue. But of course, if I don't know about it and I haven't found literature referring to it, doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't happen. And then you have further, these can split into the extreme case of retaining dark colors is white on its own, red on its own, yellow on its own, green on its own, and black and blue as the same primary color. This might have been the case for the Germanic languages for a time. There are actually some researchers who think that this was still the case for Old Norse, so in the Viking times. I don't agree with this. I'm not an expert on the topic. If you want an expert on the topic, look up Dr. Jackson Crawford, a YouTuber, cowboy, who is an actual doctor of Norse philology, and he gives out actual, lectures on Old Norse philology, so language and literature. But I agree with him that this was probably not the case. In our opinion, so in the opinion of the researchers, one of which he is, there are some words where you can clearly tell which it is supposed to be, but the borders are not quite what you might expect from today. For example, ravens are often called blue, and I can understand that, because ravens have this kind of refraction spectrum to their wings, that it looks bluish when the light reflects off them. And also sub-Saharan Africans were called the blue men in Old Norse, blåmennar. Why exactly they chose to call them blue? I don't know. Maybe someone does, but I don't. The next fourth class has white, red, yellow on their own, and then green and blue still as the same primary color. This is the system that Japanese has. Of course, in Japanese, generally, if you want to explicate something as being green, you call it midori, for example, like jade-colored. I would call my eyes jade-colored in Japanese, since this is a common way to refer to them. I don't know what emeralds are called in Japanese, but it appears that emerald as a color name is not idiomatic in Japanese. Then you have a final possibility of having white, red separately, then yellow, green, and then blue and black separately. And then further development where all of these primary colors are primary, so white, red, yellow, green, blue, black. But I'm going to continue paste through these boxes here. There's also the Russian case. Russian has one more primary color than most European languages. You have within blue, you have sini, which often gets translated as dark blue, and you have galuboy, which usually gets translated as sky blue or something like that. I think it somewhat overlaps with green, so for example, aquamarine might be galuboy as well, although I would call it green in my own language. I was looking at things on both screens, so now I'll have to check back on the comments. Yellow with green and blue, madness. I wonder how much these splits had to do with colors encountered in the natural environment of the native language. This is extremely likely, in my opinion. I think that this is probably mostly a cultural process, and it really wouldn't make sense for people to start differentiating between, say, cold colors in the tropics. So if you don't have, if your life doesn't depend on talking about dark colors in an accurate manner, I don't think that would be a priority. I lost my thought there for a little bit. Maybe I'll remember what the other thing that I wanted to say in reference to this comment was. I think someone mentioned him at the Basket Weavers. What's his YouTube channel? This is probably Jackson Crawford. I'm going to look him up right now. He's also on Patreon. He's actually currently, I think, not employed at the university, and is making enough money on YouTube and Patreon to actually support himself professionally, which is, in my opinion, a victory for both him and the public at large, because him making these professional level YouTube lessons means that a lot of people who are interested in the topic but do not have the have enough of an interest or the sitting muscles, so to say, to self-study, are also able to learn from and with him. Here is the link. I am still working through the old comments. Wouldn't a larger variety of words for certain colors in a language make those more easy to distinguish as opposed to those who don't know those words? Yes, I think this is the case. So, now I remembered what I wanted to talk about before. One moment, Chinhailos. We have cases of new primary colors coming into being in the historical era period. So we know that that they appeared. For example, orange. It is not a coincidence that the fruit orange and the color orange are called the same. The color is named after the fruit. So this is a case of a simile color, so the color of that fruit becoming a primary color in itself. This has happened further in the past as well. I know the case is that it appears that the Proto-Finnic language did not differentiate between green and some other color. So it might have been green and blue or green and yellow. So one of these two was probably Viking Age Finnish. And this is because the word for green has developed from different similes in different Baltic Finnic languages. In the case of Estonian, it is derived from the color of grass, which is fairly obvious, that is green. True. In Finnish, it is derived from the color of hate, which is a bit too culture sensitive for me to understand why green would be the color of hate. Maybe there's some overlap with envy, for example. I think envy being green is something that many Western languages associate with each other, even though there really isn't much of a reason for that either. But for some reason, probably the hate and that particular color had some kind of a cultural connection in Viking Age Finland, and because of that, the new primary color became the color of hate. Getting into even older territory, I think that for the Indo-European languages, there were a number of colors differentiated already at the beginning of the so-called Indo-European period. This is a topic that I will probably make either clips or a presentation about in the future. But in the case of the Uralic proto-language, we actually have the simile for red, that the word that red came from had not changed enough to be unidentifiable at the earliest point that we can reconstruct for the Uralic languages. And it appears that the red came from fur. So the kind of probably a deer's fur or something like that. They are reddish. Which one of these it might have been? Was this the split to red and yellow? Perhaps yellow retained the original word and red gained the lost my thought for a moment there. Badly enough that I can't. So perhaps yellow retained the original word for yellow, and red gained a new word from fur. We know that, or we can infer that there was a green-blue, union in an earlier Uralic stage. So we can rule out the what can we actually rule out? So we have to have either of these two, and we have to have red gaining its color most likely relatively late. So I think we can put out this one, but whether we are talking about this development or this development, I don't think we can say. It might be that the Uralic languages were on this path and separated red and yellow relatively late, in which case they would have gained the white, red, yellow, green, blue variant. And this would have split further in the Viking period. So this might have been the path that the Baltic Finnic languages took. A bit late on this comment, but the orange talk was fascinating. There are actually a lot of, the scientific color theory that we have today. A lot of them are actually relatively new. Let's imagine the primary colors. What are they? It's been a while since I've actually studied color theory. So actually, I'm going to draw two circles. Let's have the additive and subtractive colors to begin with. And let's try to work our way up. So here we have red, green, blue, and here we have cyan, magenta, and yellow. You can easily notice that cyan and magenta are less of core colors. This is the left one is the color system for light. So when you add red, green, and blue light, you get white light. The right one is for ink or pigments. So when you add cyan, this is a sort of aquamarine color. Magenta is sort of I think bluish purple, and yellow, you get a black pigment. What are the colors between them? It's actually surprisingly difficult, considering this is something that people are supposed to learn in high school, and I have forgotten in the years since. Let's think of what could be primary colors. We have red, blue, green, yellow, brown. I think that's an old one as well. Purple. I think purple is already one of those relatively new ones. That I think this is a Latin loan word and originally meant the kind of snail that you made purple pigment out of back in the day. What do we have? Orange. The fruit. Purple, the snail. We have violet as I think there's some technical difference between purple and violet. That one of them is a combination of red and blue, and the other one is somehow caused by all the three color sensing cells in human eyes firing at once in a specific way. But I can't remember it that well. It's another thing that I have learned and subsequently forgotten. Violet is named after a flower. Rainbow. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Indigo is another thing that I think is named after a plant that you get the indigo color from. Of course, the further you get from the primary colors, the more likely you are to be naming things after something quite modern. Well, let's not think about this too hard. I'll have some kind of a episode about this at a further time. So, can we think of something else to chat about? Grammatical cases was another thing that I've been thinking about. It's probably going to be the linguistics episode for the week after next, and that, and partially thinking about the Bantu languages this week, made me think about. Let's have the spoiler talk now. So, what kind of clips are on the way? There's the pseudoscience series. I talked about this at some point. I think probably after the Company of Crime stream on Friday. So going from high pseudoscience to low pseudoscience. The low pseudoscience ones would be positions that I hold myself, but that are not particularly strongly founded. Series. Then the Mass Monster series. This is a series about, so this would be clips about various language groups that have particularly imposing grammar in some way. For example, the Uralic languages have their astounding future. We got into this last Sunday. Please check that out if you are interested. There were, I think, 14. You have 2, then you have 4, you have 8. Yeah, 14. 14 different tenses, so ways to express relative time of different events in some stage of the Uralic languages. This has mostly disappeared in modern Finnish, for example. Then the Bantu languages, of course, have their absolute unit of a noun class or gender. Then we have the Romance languages with their conjunctive. The Romance languages actually have all of their grammar mirrored. So all of the ways that you can say something about verbs in Italian, you can say in either you know it for a fact or it might be true. So if you are reporting something that someone else has said, you use a different conjugation as when you are reporting that you know something. Io so che il cielo è azzurro. I know that the sky is blue. For example, io credo che il cielo sia azzurro. I believe that the sky is blue. This is not differentiated in English and is extremely rarely differentiated at all. And the Romance languages are the only ones that I'm familiar with where this is always perfectly the case. That you have the conjunctive mirror to each and every verb form that you have for the indicative. And then, of course, Japanese and Korean are famous for having the strongest politeness systems. Although I do not speak Korean, and I think looking it up would be too much effort for me to actually do for a clip, so I will probably use the Japanese one. And in the case of Japanese, there are actually only 2 politeness levels that happen at the conjugation level. So inflected politeness. This is the suru, shimasu. So these are both come from the same stem. There's a bit of consonant gradation and a bit of vowel gradation, so it isn't immediately obvious that it's actually the same stem. I should probably think of a better example where the stem doesn't change. What can I think of? Well, you get the idea. I'll have time to think of it for the clip. And the further the horrifying Geiger that I imagine many viewers are familiar with is mostly periphrastic. So instead of the actual words themselves changing like this, you add new words. So this is the same way that in English you can say it is, it was. This is inflection, and you can say it has been. This is periphrastic. And so in Japanese, when you want to be extremely polite, you use the polite inflection and you add some periphrastic construction around it. So politeness in English, for example, you can easily express this with periphrastic constructions. Would you be so polite as to give me this item? Instead of saying give me the item. I have not verified for myself, but I have seen fun posts implying Finnish and Korean are related. Is there some truth to it? Very vaguely. This is actually one of the topics for my pseudoscience series. But since you have asked, I am going to give you the factual information of this this clip, and actually it might be too much information for one clip, so now you are getting the deluxe variant of this topic. So we have actually let's no, I don't think I have a map prepared for this, but I'll prepare one if I get around to it, if I get to making a clip for this. But I'm going to write them roughly in the order that they exist in northern Eurasia. You have Finnish here, which is a Uralic language. Then you have Turkic languages, Central Asia and Turkey. Then you have Mongolic, Mongolian, Tuvan. Then you have the Tungus languages, such as Manchurian. And then you have the what are commonly called the Koreanic languages, which is basically only Korean. They probably had some other languages as well in the past, but they have since been eliminated. And then you have the Japonic languages. That's an O. Japonic contains Japanese and Ryukyuan. If you ask a patriotic Japanese individual, they might say that Ryukyuan is not a different language. They might say that it is a kind of Japanese. Well, that's a matter of definition. You have this split somewhere in the Roman period, where the Ryukyu languages split off from mainland Japanese, and depending on where you want, which node you want to define as Japanese, you can say that Ryukyu is a kind of Japanese, or you can say that Ryukyu is a para-Japanese language. So it's very closely related to Japanese, but not technically Japanese. It's a matter of definition. I'll take a pause to read the comment. Number groupings when counting can be peculiar in different languages. I think I read that 1 to 4 or numbers up to 20, having sometimes separate names, might hint in both cases of traces at some other language or culture. I am familiar with the phenomenon. This is the case, for example, for Russian. In Russian, you conjugate differently. For example, when you talk about ages, the word that you use for how old you are, so how many years you are, is different depending on how old you are. I think this is also very common in some Indian languages, but whether it's Aryan languages in India or Dravidic languages, I'm not quite sure. That could actually be something that I might have to jot down for a future topic. The long history of China might have made the history of languages in that area more difficult to relate to each other. Partially. The Sinitic languages have actually spread relatively recently. Chinese propaganda, of course, says that the state of China has existed for 5,000 years. This is not the case. The Sinitic languages have spread in the late Bronze Age, so the first pre-Christian millennium. Before that, we don't actually know what kind of languages were spoken in most parts of China. Chinese is, or the Sinitic languages are a part of the Sino-Tibetan languages, and came from the southeast to where they are now spoken all around China. It might be that in those areas there were some language families or languages that might explain or give good answers to how the various Asian languages are related, possibly. Unfortunately, we can't know. And I'm going to add the Austronesian languages here as well, for reasons that will become clear in the that will become clear relatively shortly. So the maximal hypothesis for this is the, I think, Trans-Eurasian languages. This is getting into the level where it's not utter Kutschwallop, so I can't say definitively that this is wrong, but it is weakly founded, and the arguments for these are would be mostly based on genetics and extremely weak linguistic evidence. An older hypothesis were the Altaic languages, which would contain Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungus languages. These are all extremely similar in the present, but yeah, the source of Japanese is unclear. That is why I did not yet join it to anything here. Really, the origin for all of these language groups is unclear. What I'm talking about now is a very radical hypothesis, joining all of them in having common origin. As I said, it's poorly founded. So going back 100 years, it was commonly believed that the Turkic, Mongolic, and Tungus languages had a common origin, and this would be called the Altaic languages. These days, we don't actually believe that, since research has... we have more information about the history of these languages. We know that they have actually converged since the Middle Ages. So they are now more similar than they were 1,000 years ago. And somewhere here we lose the resolution of historical linguistics, and we can't get any information about what happened here in the past. So it's possible that they might have a common origin. They might have diverged first and then converged later. This is, for example, the case for some European languages. I think we talked about the standard average European language Sprachbund as a concept last week. That would be a case where this has definitively happened. So all of these, in that case, this would be Northwest Indo-European, and you would have Germanic, Celtic, Germanic and Italo-Celtic languages diverging from each other and then becoming more similar to each other much later because of constant cultural contacts with each other. So it's possible that the Altaic languages are actually share a common origin, but we just don't know. After this level, it was also relatively popular to join the Uralic languages. So you would have the Uralo-Altaic languages. During the period when Japan ruled Korea, Japanese scientists were, I think, partially politically motivated to regard Korean and Japanese as having a common origin. Japan had a very interesting assimilatory policy for Korea, where they imported a lot of Japanese culture into Korea in order to make Koreans more Japanese, so that patriotic Koreans would, by default, also love the Japanese Empire. In the same way that, for example, patriotic Texans usually also love the United States. Did the Mongol conquests possibly influence the difficulty of finding relations between these languages? Might very well be. The root of the problem is that we have data points in the past, in the present, and we have some data points in the past. But the problem is that obviously from the network that has existed in the past, we are missing the... If we don't have any data points in the past, there's some level at which we just can't... We don't have any more information. So it might be, for example, that we might have development like this. And let's imagine that we can tell that these languages are related, that the fog of war, so to say, is at this level. And say this language is extinct, but this one survives. So the box is more further related to the circles than the cross would be. And if we had the cross language still existing, we might be able to reconstruct further back in the past. And in that case, we might be able to connect the box language to all of the others. But we are just missing data. So the Mongol conquests might and probably do have some influence on this. The core of the problem is linguistic assimilation. So in the past, there have been a huge amount of branches and even indirectly shooting holes into the graph. Yeah. There have been far more language variants than we know about. And knowing about some of those might resolve some questions that are now unanswerable, or at least currently unanswerable. So getting back to the question about the Chinese expansion, it might be that the Mongolian expansion, it might be the Chinese expansion. If neither of those had happened, maybe we could tell if the Trans-Eurasian languages actually are a thing or not. Unfortunately, both of them happened, or possibly fortunately if you are, as a viewer, are a Mongolian or a Chinese patriot. So every extinct language is a problem. Yeah. The more language extinction, the less, the more difficult it becomes to reconstruct the past languages. It is estimated that there were probably around 40 language families in Stone Age Europe. And as you might remember, I think we have 7 language families in modern day Europe, out of which maybe 2 of them at most are have been in Europe since the Stone Age. That's an awful lot of languages that have been made extinct by the expanding languages from outside. And that's just information that we will never have, because none of them survived. So then, the Korean and Japanese connection is a poorly founded one. You still have some researchers who subscribe to this hypothesis. I don't necessarily. I think it's probably the most likely. It's most likely, in my opinion, Korean is the most closely related language group to the Japonic languages, but this connection is probably quite distant in the past. There are also some attempts to connect Japanese with Austronesian languages. Sometimes the Korean and Japanese languages with Altaic, and the absolute maximal hypothesis is where all of these would actually be related. So in the idea behind this is that all of these are agglutinative languages, and the population speaking these share a biological origin. So this is where we get into paleodNA and a concept called something like the paternal language hypothesis or something like that. One moment, big D20, were the German people Austronesian? We don't know. Some people think they would have been. This is a question without a scientific answer. Outside trying to get at it via DNA, but DNA has a definitive connection to the individual speaking language, but no inherent connection to the language itself. So using paleodNA to reconstruct linguistic families is a bit questionable. So let's just assume that I remember correctly, and it's a paternal language hypothesis. And the idea behind this is that in some areas of the world, you can clearly see that language families and Y chromosome distribution areas match quite well. I'm only familiar with Europe. In Europe, you have the Y chromosome, comes from the father, and you have the mitochondrial DNA that comes from the mother. And both of these are immutable. They can only mutate. So you have these branching trees that you can tell in what order these mutations happened, and you have branches splitting from each other. So you can tell that, for example, let's call this guy John and this guy Mark. You can tell that John and Mark are both cousins in a way, but they are more closely related to each other than either is to... Let's not use Jack, it's too close to John. Let's call him Andy. And there are... In Europe, there are clear areas where most individuals in the male line are related to each other. For example, I think the N1C group is the one associated with the Uralic languages. So in northeastern Europe, you have the known historical spread of the Uralic languages, and you have an area where about half or even more of the men are cousins to each other and have this Y chromosome branch. So it seems likely that there's some connection there. And the N chromosome type actually comes from Asia. So this is where we get into the biological argument for the poorly founded hypothesis about northeastern Eurasian languages. So for the father's side, you have these areas that correlate fairly well with language areas, but for the mitochondrial DNA, you don't have that kind of areas. You basically have the same kinds of mitochondrial DNA all around Europe. You have larger regions, like there is a mitochondrial border between Europe and Asia, with an overlap area in Western Siberia. But for Europe, you basically have the case that for a long time, probably the easy explanation for this is that in the same way that things happened in history, that Europe was largely patrifocal. This means that when a couple marries, they move into the home of the husband. The opposite of this would be matrifocal, where the husband moves to the wife's or the bride's village or house or family. Neolocal, where they establish a new location that is not the ancestral home of either. There are some others as well that I can't remember because they get into some really weird social structures. But it seems that Europe has been patrifocal for a long time. So when people from neighboring villages married, the wife would move into the village of the husband. And over a long period of time, this leads to the this would lead to the mitochondrial DNA being spread around Europe in the way that it is. And the paternal language hypothesis is that children would be more likely to learn their language from their father in this kind of patrifocal, patrilinear societies. And then we get into the languages themselves. If I sketch an Asia here, we have Chukotka, Kamchatka, Korea, China, Southeast Asia here, Siam, Burma, India, something like here, Japan. When we look at these Y chromosome developments, you could draw not quite that east, you could draw an arrow like this leading to the N Y chromosome type. I'm going to use a bit of color for this. Let's get an orange one for the Uralic languages. Basically, you have the Uralic languages being spoken here. Or actually, how am I going to visualize this? Like, I want to have information about the DNA and the languages at the same time. Let's use the colors for DNA. So let's say orange here is the Y chromosome type N. You also have some of it here. The question is whether this population here is only biologically related to the Uralics, or whether their language, the name of which I can't remember at this time, is also descended from a common ancestor. We don't know. There are definite similarities. It might be that there was a wave of immigration from Uralic-speaking areas, but they did not manage to assimilate the locals. Who knows? Then we have the one that it branches off from. The problem is that I can't remember which one this is. This is relatively common in, say, China. I think it's a majority one in Japan as well. And then you have I think you have another one in the islands, the Austronesian languages. And if I recall correctly, the branching pattern of this actually fits the Trans-Eurasian language hypothesis suspiciously well. So this is a weak data point that you can't, or I can't say that it's absolute, that it's a lie. It's not wrong enough to be falsifiable, but it's not well-founded enough to be serious science. So what else can I say? So it's vaguely possible that you would have, say, the Uralic languages here. Then you have maybe Japanese and Korean in this branch. Austronesian in this one. And maybe somehow the Turkic and, you know, who knows. The point is that these languages are similar and they have a biological element in common. But whether or not this also means that they have a common origin is not clear. Actually, whether or not languages in general have a common origin is something that's not known for sure. This is called the Nostratic hypothesis. And this is simply the idea that human language has appeared once, and every language and language family that we currently have is somehow descended from this one. We might have, well, let's not mess it up that badly. You might have the Uralic here, you might have the Dravidian here. We don't know if that's the case or whether there were several origins for languages, for spoken language. We know from, for example, the case of the Nicaraguan Sign Language that it's possible for languages to appear ex nihilo, as they say, from nothing. We just don't know which of these is correct. Could languages form a pseudo-common origin if they interact enough with each other? I think that a contact language is close enough to what you're thinking about. I don't know if you would agree. We've talked about contact languages every now and then. So this is the kind of process that, for example, English and the Romance languages have gone through. Perhaps some of the new viewers are not familiar with this, so it's not too much of a retread. English and the Romance. So both of these are languages that were caused by the merger of North Sea Germanic and North Germanic in the case of English. These were languages that were closely related, but had specific differences in some key areas, such as particularly in the grammar. The words for the, for example, have been practically eliminated in English, most likely because they were subtly different in Old Norse and Old English. Languages appearing from nothing might get into neurolinguistics. Partly. I don't know, neurolinguists might be able to answer the question of whether spoken languages can appear out of nothing. Well, they have to be, since we have at least one of them. I mean, over a very long time span, so it appears to us as though they might have a common origin. Here we get into, I'm going to finish my map here in any case, in case someone in the audience doesn't know this yet. So the Romance languages were produced by a similar merger between the Latin, the Faliscan, the Oscan, and the Umbrian languages. In the case of English, these were all Germanic. In the case of Romance, these were all Italic. So you are describing a very old Sprachbund. I think so, yes. So this is already might be the case for. So this was the case for the Altaic languages. So that the again we have the Turkic, Mongol, and Tungus that form a Sprachbund and become more similar to each other, so that we mistake them for being very closely related in the recent past. It might very well be that something like this has already happened at some point in the past. Having a definite example of this is going to be difficult. Well, in the case of the Altaic languages, if we did not have the medieval information about these, then we would have a case of this exact thing that you are describing. Whether or not it might have happened somewhere else is another question. I'm wondering, thinking about if I can think of a case where that might be the case. I can think of some examples where this appears to have been the case for languages that we know were originally related. So a sort of a similar case to the standard average European case for Western Europe. We have a case in the Uralic languages where we have the East and the non-East. Let's call this West Central. And in the East, we have Hungarian. And here we have Central in general, but I think Murray in particular. The Hungarians went on an adventure in the migrations era. Well, that's why it's called the migration period, because a lot of tribes or groups like this went on wild adventures. The Hungarians started out in western Siberia. They appear to have crossed the Ural Mountains and spent some time on the southwestern edge of the Ural Mountains, so in close proximity with the Central and I think in particular the Murray languages. And they have had some sort of effect on each other. This is unfortunately something that I'm not that familiar with, so exactly what kind of effects these are, it's not quite clear to me. But the Hungarians later went on to arrive in modern-day Hungary. There have been some hypotheses linking Hungarian with the Central Uralic languages instead of the East Uralic languages because of exactly this. So the way I told you this is the way that I hold myself, and I think that it is the majority opinion in the field. But again, this topic is not quite my specialty. Actually, none of the things that I talk about on stream are my particular specialty. Mostly, or let's say for two reasons. One of them is, let's call it operational security. To be quite accurate, this would have to be, I think this would be informational security. I have a quite specific specialty, so if I were to talk about that, it would make it perhaps too easy to identify me as an individual. But, Luckily, until now, I have not interacted with any malicious individuals um, while VTubing, but that is always a possibility. So making it difficult to identify my person is a good idea. Other one is my employer. I work at a state institution, a museal institution that has relatively stringent regulations on communicating with media or posting on social media. My employer would like to have contact with the outside world exclusively through the public relations office. So if I were to talk about the kinds of things that I concretely do at work, they might be displeased with me. So I don't. So these are two reasons to not talk about what I do at work and not talk about, for example, what kind of topics I had for my master's thesis, for example. I don't think I will ever tell you the topic or title of my master's thesis, because then it would be quite easy to identify me. But let's say that my specialty is related to the topics that I talk about here. For good reason, yeah. PR department is probably the correct word for this. If you told us, you wouldn't still be a suspicious man. That is correct. I would no longer be a suspect. Of course, as it stands, you actually have absolutely no reason to believe that I actually know any of these things. I might actually be an engineer, for example. An engineer who is has made a huge effort to appear like I know something. There's a good possibility, I think. A good possibility you're just making all this up. That is also a possibility. If you have no prior information about historical linguistics, you actually have no way of judging whether or not what I am telling you is actually true, or if I am an actual expert in it. This is actually, I think this is a part of the reason that I found VTubing to be so, psychologically easy. As I alluded to at some point, I thought about having a YouTube channel at some point, but I thought that would be far too much work doing the graphics, and while making clips, I take like 3 or 5 takes for a 2-minute comments. So actually making edited videos would be a huge amount of work. And of course, if I make any mistakes while talking as a cartoon on twitch.tv, well, it's your problem for believing a suspicious man on the internet. If I was making YouTube videos, and even worse with my own face or name, I'd have to make a horrifying effort to actually not misspeak or make some kind of, thoughtless mistakes. Actually, has the chat window been working during the stream? I have been reading the chat from the OBS window. Now that I looked at my... No. Well, luckily I've read them aloud, so this shouldn't be a problem, but that's something that I have somehow bungled and I will have to fix for next time. Some hobbyists tend to dabble in very specialized topics in their own leisure, so you could possibly be anyone at all. That is actually surprisingly true. I have taken some classes in anthropology and touched on some folkloristics. And it turns out that metal fans actually they don't make research in the topic, but they do write very high level summaries for their own use. So when they are studying and trying to synthesize different folkloric sources, they do a surprisingly good job at it. Like methodologically sound job of it. So I think that's enough about this topic. Let's see if there's something else that I can think of, or you can think of, or will we end the session sometime soon? We have actually now, I think, been going on for almost an hour and a half in the chat session. Yes, well, 1 hour 20 minutes of free chat. Seems like we are coming to an end. So once again, thanks to everyone for watching and chatting. This hour and a half, of course, would not have happened without your comments and questions. Particular thanks to everyone chatting, and of course, thanks to everyone watching. And I hope you have enjoyed it and found it interesting. So now I am going to check the there is a someone that I follow is actually streaming. Someone that I think wrong window. Someone that I think most of you will probably not be familiar with. There is a live 2D cubism rigging action happening. I'm going to take us there.